I guess if you follow the news, it's been encouraging that there seems to be some momentum around the affordable housing issue, particularly here in Los Angeles with the passage of JJJ, Measure H, Measure S to a certain extent. And as I was driving in this morning, I actually heard the mayor on the radio, maybe some of you did as well, talking about JJJ and that we need more YIMBYism in Los Angeles. So hopefully the tides are turning a little bit. UCLA, we are a public university, we have a public mission, and we have really a mandate to provide public service, and programs and forums today are part of that. So glad that you could make it. I hope that you learn a little bit, that you find some value in today's program. It's a really spectacular lineup. I do want to acknowledge our partners at Mercy Housing, Doug Shoemaker, Ami Pasquale, where's he over here somewhere? Oh, in the back, Spear, and Ed Holder. I'm not sure if Ed's here today yet, but he will be here. And they've just been extraordinary partners, and we're happy to have them. With that, I would like to turn it over to my partner in crime, Doug Shoemaker.
Thanks, Tim. I also want to thank UCLA and Tim and Julie in particular and Stuart for the partnership over the years on this. It seems like we're gathering momentum, and the room is full today, which is fantastic, which I hope means we have to go to a bigger room next year. I'm lobbying now, Tim, for the bigger room. But no, this has been fantastic, and UCLA has been incredibly generous, and we want to thank Howard and Irene Levine, also for their tremendous partnership around the center and with Mercy Housing. I'm going to skip a lot because I know we're a little bit behind on schedule, but Mercy Housing, a nonprofit housing organization, a developer, property manager, service provider, and we have offices in LA, San Francisco, and Sacramento. We don't do a lot of work on middle-income housing, and I think that's true of a lot of folks in the room. A tremendous interest in the topic. As Tim was saying, as the affordable housing crisis gets worse, more and more people start to know about what we do, which is in some ways a sign of our failure, but it's also an opportunity. And so I think today what we're trying to focus in on is how do we acknowledge sort of the growing scale of the affordable housing problem here in Los Angeles, but throughout the state of California, and then what do we have to do differently than we've been doing in the past, or do more of if we're really going to get at solving this problem in California, which is easily among the worst problems in the country. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my speakers. We have two fabulous speakers. Paul Ong, who many of you know, is a professor here of urban planning, social welfare, and Asian American studies. He's going to introduce the topic. And then I'm going to introduce Ann Sewill now, also who is vice president of what she said was housing and related stuff at the California Community Foundation. And Ann probably needs no introduction in this room, but she's spent multiple decades working in the affordable housing field, is everybody's favorite housing activist, at least in my mind. And so Ann, I'm sure, will be very tentative and share very few opinions of hers. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul.
Thank you. I have the privilege of being a professor, being this way, being a little absent-minded. What I'm going to talk about is preaching to the choir. But what I hope to do is give you a little bit more detail and the nuances of what you already know and experience on the ground. So I am going to make, hopefully, just 3 quick points. The first one is, before I go on, I want to thank the Ziman Center and the Haynes Foundation for supporting our work at my center on inequality in Los Angeles and its impacts, particularly on the housing sector. So we're grateful for their support. The first point is that you're all aware nationally there's been growing income and wealth inequality. And it's affected the country. It also has affected Los Angeles. In fact, the level of inequality in Los Angeles is higher than the nation as a whole. You could see some of the driving forces behind it. One is that particularly in the middle, the median household income has declined dramatically nationally as well as here in Los Angeles. Here in Los Angeles, about from $65,000 to $59,000 over a quarter century. The number that falls into the middle class, there's different ways of defining the middle class. So there's no right way, but if you take the range between $45,000 to $125,000 in terms of household income, that segment declined from about 46 to 47% down to about 41% here in Los Angeles. You could see in the graph about how households have been redistributed here in Los Angeles over the last quarter century. And one of the things you clearly notice is that the two ends are increasing at the expense of the middle. So people have interpreted this as the collapse of the middle class. Maybe that's a little bit too dramatic, but there's no question the middle class has declined, and certainly it's been under economic pressure. That has been accompanied by housing prices increasing at a dramatic rate. And Los Angeles is among the most expensive relative to income. By one measure, it is the most expensive in this country relative to income. You could see this in terms of median home values, which increased from about $400,000 in 1990 to nearly $500,000 in 2015. And the number of what we could consider entry-level units have decreased dramatically. Here, this graph sort of illustrates the differences in the distribution of homes in terms of values over the last quarter century. These are in constant dollar terms. Again, what you see is at the very low end, a noticeable decline shifting to the much more expensive homes. As a consequence of the declining income and increasing prices, the middle class, and particularly those who are trying to get into homeownership, have been squeezed. And that problem was made worse here in Los Angeles by the foreclosure crisis, which drove the Great Recession. And whereas we thought about people entering into homeownership by buying less expensive home as a first step and a number step of moving up, unfortunately for many, it proved to be a one-way street where the foreclosure crisis pushed them back into rental property. In fact, homeownership in Los Angeles over the last decade or so declined by 5 percentage points. That's rather dramatic in terms of the decrease in this market. And being pushed into the rental market doesn't help you, because the same shift that we've seen in terms of housing prices, we also see in terms of the rental markets. So again, what you see is at the bottom end, the number of units, relative number of units that's available, has decreased dramatically. And again, the shift in terms of rents asked, not just new units, but existing units also. Rents asked at the high end growing relatively much faster. And part of the problem, and my colleagues are much better at explaining why this happened, is a decrease in the pipeline of supply of housing. So on the left side, you see sort of the long-term picture. That's based on American Community Survey. I know we all have some doubts about it, but I think it does pick up the general trend. If you want a closer look year by year based on parcel data in terms of new construction, that's on the right hand. And so what we see there also is this sort of dramatic decline in the supply of housing. Without that new supply of housing, both to accommodate population growth as well as replacement, the market will get increasingly squeezed, and that's going to be compounded because I don't think it's going to be very easy for us to climb out of the economic inequality that we've been experiencing over the last quarter century. So hopefully there are solutions, but I think it's important those solutions are very cognizant of the larger macro forces at work nationally as well as here in Los Angeles. Thank you.
Good morning. So, as Doug said, I'm Ann Sewill, Mercy Housing California board member and a graduate of this fine institution. So those are the only two things you didn't know about me. A couple of years ago in my annual performance review, my boss wrote, "Ann is generous in her opinions." So I think he meant generous in sharing her opinions. So I'm happy to have that opportunity today. So I'm going to talk about something that you might think, well, boy, she's a one-trick pony, one HHH, and all she can talk about is homelessness. We're here to talk about middle-income housing. But I really see the housing insecurity problem as a continuum, with homelessness as the extreme end of it, And I apologize that the picture here of healthy, affordable, and secure is a single-family home, because I don't believe that's the only way to be healthy, affordable, and secure. But it really is a continuum. And you know, in Los Angeles County, we've all seen this a number of times. We have about 45,000 homeless people in the last count, about half of them unsheltered, and that's split evenly between the city and the county, more or less. But interestingly, it's not just people on the street who are feeling deeply housing insecure. Last spring, 1,400 LA County residents, as part of the what became Measure H polling, were asked if they feared that they would become homeless in the next 12 months. And most noticeable for me on this, of the depth of the housing insecurity problem, is that 30% of the residents making between $60,000 and $90,000 a year said yes. 30% of the people that work for you or work in your office fear that they could become homeless, you know, in the next year. We know that there's a problem, you know, of affordability in Los Angeles. There's a problem across the board. Interestingly, you know, Paul talked about sort of we're no longer a bell curve in terms of the middle being the most people. We're more up on the ends of, you know, extremely low income or extremely high income. And in each of these communities, I sat down and calculated what could the median income afford in terms of rents. And it's always a little bit off of the median household income, which I think is an indicator of sort of lag in counting household incomes. Right now, the units that are being built are asking between $400 and $600 a square foot. So a 1,000 square foot unit would be somewhere around $4,000 to $6,000, which is far off the $2,000 median across all units, including old units. So we talk a lot about production as the need for, as a key part of the solution, and I truly believe that. But we need to be careful. Simple production will not solve the problem. We need intentional, targeted production across all of our unserved income bands, including moderate income, workforce, low income, so on. In the last 3 years, we've produced basically 1,200 units overall that are affordable. This is a little deceptive because we don't actually count moderate or workforce housing units created, because unless they come in and do a deed restriction for some bond reason or density bonus reason, the city doesn't know about them. So it's underreported in those, unless it's true that we only build luxury units or subsidized units, which that may be true. Looking back more over the last 7 years, you can see that the blue line was our goal for the regional housing needs assessment. The pink or purple line is what we actually produced. We're doing far better in terms of the above moderate income than we are in the other categories. Produced almost 80% of our goal in the above moderate income. But if you broke that down, you would see that actually we're producing a lot in the luxury units, which are not necessarily going to Los Angeles County residents. You know, they may be second homes for people from out of state, out of country. So we have a real gap in each of these categories. And then if we do need to be intentional, we do need money to do that. We've all heard that over the last, the good news is a year or so ago, I was here for the LA Business Council thing, and we were bemoaning the fact that we'd lost 72% of the funding in the last few years that we had. With the passage of HHH and H, we're only at 62%, down from pre-2008. But we still have quite a ways to go. Measure HHH takes us a little bit up, but in order to just get to where we were, we have quite a ways to go. So what are sort of and you're just back in time, Mott, for number 3. The policy goals that we're pushing on right now. One is the City of LA is trying to update its community plans. The mayor made a pledge on Thursday at the State of the City speech that they would all happen in 6 years, and the city planning director looked sort of aghast. But that would help because, you know, the more you can do by right and within a community plan and fight those fights out ahead of time, the easier it is for developers to develop. Streamlining is a constant goal and thing that we're working on in City Hall. On the permanent supportive housing piece, interestingly, when we got all the developers together to work on what became Measure HHH, their interest was half in producing more revenue and half in cutting the city permitting process from 2.5 years to 1 year. So for them, it was just as important. And we sat down and calculated the extra 1.5 years works out to 300 to 500,000 a development. So it's not nothing to be able to streamline your project. We need new local funding sources because, trust me, they are not coming from DC. And it sounds like Sacramento may have a lot of other things on their hands, like filling the gaps in the Medi-Cal program. And so before the council right now is a proposal to adopt a linkage fee similarly to other, many other cities around California that would produce some local funding for those folks. I was having a conversation with one of my partners in crime on the HHH campaign, who was like, why do we need a linkage fee? We just passed HHH. And I said, well, imagine 2 years from now. You're walking down the street and your neighbor comes up and says, I'm going to pull your arms off and hit you over the head because you promised me that encampment that's under, the freeway would be gone if I voted for this thing, and it's not. And as our friend Mark Trotz, who runs the Housing for Health program, says, he's moved 2,000 people off Skid Row in the last 6 months, and you can't see it. Why? Because the upstream problem has not been solved. We have constant new flows of people coming into homelessness. So we really do need to look at that whole continuum. And then renter protections, we just voted to expand Measure M, which is the metro funding to take our transit system from touching 19 cities to almost twice that across the county in the next 20 years. Only 4 of those cities have any form of renter protection, and so those residents are concerned about displacement and what that will look like. So, thank you.
So I'm going to ask a couple questions, then we're going to open it up. I just want to start by asking either of you or both of you, the graph, Paul, that you put together on wealth and income inequality is always intriguing to me when you tie it to the production levels. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about sort of how the changes in income in particular are making it more complicated to actually produce housing in the way that Ann described, housing that hits specific price points or populations. And Ann, you're welcome to answer it too.
I'll give a simplistic answer. I'm sure it's much more complex. It's simple in a market where supply is constrained either by regulation. Here in Los Angeles, we have the longest gestation period between getting a permit and actually putting the units in place. When you in such a market, clearly you want to maximize. In a world with increasing income inequality, which segment has the ability to buy limited supply? And I think that goes a long way of explaining some of the things we're seeing. So actually, when we're monitoring some of the new development and new construction and so forth, we do see this upward bias in terms of the supply, except for units that through subsidies or through negotiation is targeted to the low income. So it's not, again, that there's a collapse in the middle in terms of the housing market, but what we see is a fundamental shift in the distribution of what's being produced. And we're also producing far less than we have in the past.
All right. Well, so a related question. Whenever in a room full of housers, we're sort of all equally perplexed, like here's the problem, here's our incredible solution, and yet somehow the electorate or the neighborhood public or the voting public or however you define the public is less enamored of our solution, or they don't, we sort of continually go back and forth and say, look, the answer is supply, or the answer is more money for this problem, or some combination. And yet the graph would seem to suggest that there may be a difference between our version of the solution and how the public thinks about it. Is that part of the problem, or do you think there's something else at work here that's more powerful in terms of why we're not getting to the production levels we want?
So the voters in March fairly soundly rejected Measure S, which tells me that they're not so far off the solution as we would think. And I haven't seen any, I don't even know if we can get an age breakdown on who voted for what, but, sort of on the campaign trail, what we heard was that younger people definitely got that their futures are tied to housing production, that shutting down the spigot isn't going to help them. So I think, just as we are seeing with any sort of assisted housing, siting is always, people love the idea of getting homeless people off the street or providing housing for their children, but, the whole idea of where do you put it is a challenge. One city councilwoman who isn't represented here from a city that isn't Los Angeles, in a meeting about the the housing production thing after the homeless measure passed, used the phrase I hadn't heard a politician use before of spine up. We need to spine up. So I think we need to see that in the combination of our leadership and the leadership in this room, the developers as well.
All right, so I'm going to open it up. I just ask that you keep your questions to questions and kind of keep your policy declarations and statements to the lunchtime hour or cocktail hour, if you don't mind. So
when I look at Redfin, Trulia, things like this, I see that the vast majority of listings are existing units that were not built in the last year, 2, 3 years. I'm interested in why our conversation focuses exclusively on a new supply that matches the demand. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how this enormous supply of existing units and how that impacts our strategy and how we might change the way we think about new supply in the context of the massive existing supply of housing that we have.
Paul, you want to start? Go ahead.
Just two things. Los Angeles is massive, so it's not surprising to have massive number of units. What makes a difference is how massive is that supply relative to the demand or what people would like to see in housing. So it's massive, you're right. It's the market in terms of if you look at the typical units that's on sale, or even the rental units. They're existing units. But the truth of the matter is that the existing stock is tied to any new production. What happens on the margin or doesn't happen on the margin affects the existing stock in terms of price and so forth. So again, I realize it's much more complicated than that, but in some ways it's also very simple in terms of understanding what the supply is. It is massive in absolute sense, but not necessarily in relative sense. And what happens in our margin makes a huge difference in terms of what's happening with the existing stock in terms of rental market and as well as the home ownership market.
May I clarify the question?
Sure.
When you look at the price of housing, certainly the supply relative to demand is, the marginal supply is what's going to dictate the price of housing. But we seem to do policy as though the new supply defines what if a new unit comes in for $1 million, the existing units will be $1 million. And what I'm seeing is that it's the existing units that are actually defining the price of the new ones that come on the market, not the other way around.
No, right. And this is, I think I'll just take the question for 1 second. I mean, there's a lot of debate around sort of how filtering works, right? And the degree to which older units sort of find a price point that's more affordable than the ability to kind of build that unit new. And I would say, to your point earlier, that there's definitely a bias in the affordable housing funding world in that most of the money that's made available for affordable housing is for the creation of housing. And I think that's more true in California than maybe other states. If you look at Ohio and other parts of the country where there's just a massive amount, a glut of previously foreclosed homes and so forth, more of an effort on acquisition rehab than we see in California. I think I've been in the state working for 20 years, and I think ever since I've been here, there's just been an incredible emphasis on the fact that we have an overall supply problem, and therefore we try and spend our affordable housing dollars to accomplish multiple goals. And I personally think you're right, and Mercy and others have tried to do some work on this. The big challenge in the affordable housing world is acquiring enough capital or consolidating enough capital to actually compete against other folks that are trying to do the same work. And I don't have any data on it, but I mean, one of the things that we haven't talked about so far is the real rise of rental REITs and the degree to which the single family homes in Sacramento and other places that previously had been entry-level home ownership are now part of a consolidated rental market, and I think that's having an effect. I haven't seen any research on that yet, but I have no doubt that it's having an effect, along with VRBO and Airbnb and a lot of other kind of disruptive approaches to housing, which we're struggling to figure out how to deal with from a housing supply perspective and a community perspective. So I think the affordable housing world and the middle income housing world needs to move dramatically towards acquisitions and rehabs. And the challenge is complex. It has to do with the policy work and the funding and a bunch of other things, but I think it's the right direction to push in. All right, other questions?
If you really look at 1990 to 2015, the major change in much of the county is it's a lot safer. And in many of the neighborhoods that have experienced such an appreciation in value, that's where it is much safer to live. And I think that's changed the investment opportunities in so many neighborhoods. And so my question is, what are the strategies to protect people who are now benefiting in a safe neighborhood that in 1990 no one would have been willing to invest there because no one's going to pay that much for rent or to purchase? And now throughout so much of Los Angeles, it's safer to build, it's safer to invest, and safer for people to move in who can afford to. What are the strategies around preserving the sort of price affordability for people who live there through the rough times and are now benefiting from a slightly safer neighborhood that's obviously an attractive place for real estate investment?
What I interpreted, maybe I got this wrong, was just sort of as these neighborhoods improve in popularity and the price point goes up, there are a bunch of people who struggle through hard times and are at risk of getting forced out. That's one part of it? Displacement?
I agree and disagree. Actually, if you look at the housing market over time, particularly over the last boom, where the boom was most accentuated is actually in the areas that are most disadvantaged. And these are areas highly correlated with, if you want to use a safety index or a crime index and so forth, are the ones that are much more in terms of people's perception and actual reality is less safe. Those markets tend to be much more volatile. So over the very short run, particularly over this last housing boom, that's where the market sort of prices increase much more rapidly than the county as a whole. It's also the area which offered the first set of opportunities to a number of individuals to buy in, particularly a large number of people of color. These are also the markets that collapsed the most and the markets that had the greatest foreclosure. So in some ways, these markets are the ones that are very difficult to deal with because the impacts on people in terms of what they have to pay, what they have to suffer in terms of losses. So people do want to probably move out of these, many of these neighborhoods to safer neighborhoods. There's no question about that. But again, if you segment Los Angeles' housing market, you see very different dynamics. And lots is happening in these sort of lower income, lower home value, lower rent areas. Many of these areas also are now going through a perception of threat because on the margins, particularly where we make major governmental infrastructure investments in transit, in other types of development, these are also the areas that have gentrification. Gentrification has positive aspects. I'm not against gentrification, but there's a downside, which is around displacement, what happens to the existing stakeholders and so forth, that we ought to be cognizant of.
So yes, and we're working on a fund right now with Metro and some other foundations and some banks that will allow nonprofit developers or mission-aligned for-profit developers to go out and buy buildings in transit neighborhoods that are going to have a station in the next 10 years, and hold on to them and eventually redevelop them to a higher density in most cases. So our prototypes are projects like the Roland Curtis one over by USC, 48 units, huge parking lot, 2 steps from the Vermont and Expo station. And the idea is it can be rebuilt to 150 units, and all the tenants can be relocated within that building, and another 100 units, provided. Doing that in Boyle Heights, some other neighborhoods. So if you're going to preserve in rapidly changing neighborhoods like Highland Park or parts of South LA or Boyle Heights, you've got to be intentional about it. It's not going to magically occur where a few people will be able to enjoy the benefits of it, you have to try to, basically carve out pockets of affordability in a changing community.
Great. I think we have time for one last question. I saw a hand over there. So what I hear you asking, see if I get this right, is a combination of sort of rent control for owners, which is Prop 13, property tax control, and rent control. The combination, how has that affected the housing market? You didn't want that part about rent control for property owners.
No, it's not about the property tax issue. It's an issue of rent control for raising rents that has a limiting effect on the supply of housing. It prevents developers from redeveloping their properties. And especially lower density, less efficient properties into higher density, more efficient properties.
Got it. Okay.
So it restricts supply, which increases rents.
All right. So now you've got the question.
So since Costa-Hawkins was passed and no new developments are covered under rent control, exactly which, is it just the general anguish that rents might be restricted in the future that is causing a chilling effect?
What he's saying is
How does
that there are
relate to-
people with very low assessed value who, if they redevelop their property, they're going to see a major increase in property tax in combination with rent control that he's saying is a disincentive to redevelopment. I think that's what you... Okay, sorry.
But even in communities without rent control, if you redevelop your property, you're going to see a major reassessment.
Right. I mean, I think there's nobody on this panel, except for maybe Paul, you can say no, that would, I'm just teasing, that doesn't think that a lot of the problem in our housing markets are very strange public policy message being driven by things like Prop 13 that are clearly having an impact and having that impact. We're going to have Paul and Ann just say one quick last word, and then Ben Metcalf is going to answer all of these questions for us in 45 minutes. And all of the people that were unsatisfied with our answers are going to get it from Ben. So one last quick point, Paul or Ann, if you have anything to add before Ben jumps up.
I think production is really important to addressing the overall issue of, housing for any income level workforce. And one of the challenges that we have in Los Angeles County overall, but particularly in the city, is that production is such a heroic effort. And that what we really need to be able to do is to make it much less heroic, which would hopefully mean a lot more folks would engage in it, which would increase the supply and eventually reduce the shortage.
In many ways, I'm positive about the future because I see movements on the policy front. I also appreciate how the markets work, and we need to make them much more effective for developers. We need to have those policies in place. But I just want to make one note on policies. You could have the best policies in the world. If it's not implemented well, then you could fail as a policy. And how do you know you're implementing well? It requires us to really monitor and evaluate. And it is through like the Ziman Center that support that types of work that we can monitor ourselves in terms of our progress and refine what we're doing. Because otherwise, you're just living on hope in terms of having goodwill policies. You really need to monitor and evaluate. And it's great to be at an event like here, where we can hear different voices from different stakeholders, because that feeds back into how we evaluate, how we assess, how we monitor. And our goal is really public service, community service. That's the goal of Ziman Center. That is, how can we help others, different stakeholders, through our research? And I hope to continue doing that, and I hope you support that. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Paul and Ann.